I returned to 428 Ridge Road after 22 years of hazardous service, holding my 8-year-old daughter Maya's hand. Expecting pride from my husband Marcus after my promotion to Master Sergeant, I instead found divorce papers fanned across the kitchen island. Beside him stood Celeste, an unfamiliar woman waiting to declare my eviction. Marcus spat the word soldier like a bitter insult, demanding my immediate departure. I didn't cry. I simply smiled, my composure entirely intact, because they had no idea whose land they were standing on. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. There was no screaming match. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I retreated calmly, holding Maya's hand as we walked out the front door and drove to a quiet extended stay suite near the transport depot. By 9 o'clock that evening, Maya was fast asleep, surrounded by her stuffed animals like a secure garrison. She was safe, and that was the only operational priority that mattered. I sat at the small desk in the corner, the glow of my laptop illuminating the dark room. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. For years, I had fallen into the trap of normalized cruelty. I had treated Marcus's coldness as an acceptable operating cost. I'd been the silent investor in his version of a family, accepting his casual dismissals and emotional distance as standard operating procedure. When you spend 2 decades in hazardous environments, you learn to adapt to hostility. You normalize the harsh conditions just to survive the deployment. But marriage isn't a combat zone, and love shouldn't be a subscription where you foot the bill while someone else reaps the benefits. Marcus had weaponized my absence. He mistook my disciplined silence for compliance. He thought normalized cruelty would keep me docile, assuming I would just absorb the shock of another betrayal. He was operating on outdated intelligence. I opened my encrypted digital ledgers. I didn't need his permission, and I certainly didn't need his money. I reviewed 22 years of accumulated service pay, carefully managed dividend portfolios, and combat zone savings. The numbers scrolled across the screen, a testament to decades of rigorous financial discipline. Marcus thought he held the leverage because he was standing in the kitchen, but he was holding a hand of cards in a game I owned the casino for. Then, I accessed the scanned copy of the document that mattered most, the original property deed to 428 Ridge Road. The physical copy was safely bolted in a heavy floor safe hidden in the back of my closet, a safe Marcus didn't even know existed. He thought the house was marital property. He thought he could evict me from the very foundation I had laid before I ever signed a marriage certificate. I reviewed the deed, reading my name, Victoria Hayes, printed clearly as the sole owner. I drafted a precise, unemotional email to my legal counsel, attaching the deed and outlining the exact tactical response required. There was no hesitation, no breakdown, just immediate, decisive action. The operation had shifted from domestic endurance to absolute legal retaliation. I closed my laptop at midnight, the blue light fading from the room. Marcus and Celeste thought they had staged a successful coup. They didn't realize they had just triggered a calculated, overwhelming counteroffensive. At exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, a process server walked up the driveway of 428 Ridge Road. I wasn't there to watch, but my attorney's paralegal confirmed the delivery. Marcus answered the door, probably expecting a moving company or a defeated wife ready to negotiate terms of surrender. Instead, he was handed a thick legal packet. Inside were the documents that would systematically dismantle his entire reality. The packet contained irrefutable, notarized proof that the property was titled solely in my name, purchased exactly 8 months before our courthouse wedding. It was a pre-marital asset, entirely insulated from his desperate claims. This is the invisible armor of the long game survivor. When you spend your life anticipating worst-case scenarios, you don't build houses made of straw. You build fortresses. You forge armor out of legal documentation and quiet foresight. Marcus thought my time deployed was a weakness, a gap in the timeline he could exploit. He never realized that while I was enduring the harsh realities of my service, I was also fortifying my defenses. The long-game survivor doesn't react to the immediate sting of betrayal. We rely on the meticulous preparations made years in advance. My security was never tied to his fidelity. It was bolted into the foundation of my own independence. By 9:15, my phone started lighting up. Marcus called. Once, twice, 5 times. I watched his name flash across the screen in the quiet of the extended stay suite. I didn't answer. I didn't decline the calls. I just let them ring out into the digital void. Anger wasn't going to solve this. Communication was a tactical error at this phase of the operation. This wasn't a conversation. It was an eviction notice, and the terms were non-negotiable. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and checked the security camera feed from the garage, which I still controlled. The live video showed Celeste. She had been in the middle of hauling boxes of her belongings out of her luxury SUV, eager to claim her newly conquered territory. Suddenly, Marcus burst into the garage, clutching the legal packet, his face flushed and mouth moving frantically. Even without audio, the panic was deafening. Celeste's unpacking came to an abrupt, screeching halt. She dropped a cardboard box onto the concrete floor, staring at Marcus as he pointed to the deed. The arrogance that had coated their faces yesterday was completely gone, replaced by the jarring realization that their grand victory was a catastrophic failure. They weren't shocked by what they had done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. I took a sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter taste. They had demanded I leave my own home. They had tried to weaponize my career against me, but they had fundamentally miscalculated the situation. I closed the camera application. They had exactly 30 days to pack up their shattered illusions and vacate my property. The countdown had officially begun. The frantic scramble began immediately. Marcus retained an aggressive, high-priced attorney named Curtis, a man known for bullying opposing counsel and finding loopholes where none existed. Curtis immediately filed an emergency motion, attempting to classify the mortgage payments made during our marriage as marital contributions, thereby entitling Marcus to equitable distribution of the asset. It was a predictable, desperate maneuver. They were throwing legal grenades, hoping something would detonate and damage my impenetrable armor. But this wasn't revenge. It was accounting. I had kept my finances entirely segregated from day one. Every mortgage payment, every property tax bill, every repair invoice had been paid from an account funded solely by my military pay and individual dividends. Marcus hadn't contributed a single cent to the homestead. He had treated the house like a free hotel for over 2 decades. Now, the management was presenting him with the final bill. But Curtis was relentless. He tried to subpoena the original purchase agreements, digging through county archives to find any technicality that could invalidate my sole ownership. In doing so, Curtis accidentally triggered a secondary revelation, one that elevated the stakes from a simple marital dispute to an unbreakable historical claim. The property at 428 Ridge Road wasn't just a random parcel of real estate. I hadn't bought it from a faceless corporation. The origin of the deed was tied to a deep, unshakable debt of honor. When Curtis pulled the archival records, he uncovered the name of the original seller, Eleanor Vance. What Curtis didn't understand, and what Marcus had never bothered to learn, was the history behind that transaction. 22 years ago, before I was a master sergeant, before I ever met Marcus, my unit had served alongside Eleanor's grandson. He was a good man, a dedicated soldier, and he didn't make it home. I was the one who brought his personal effects back to Eleanor. I sat in her living room, drinking tea, and shared the stories of his bravery. When Eleanor decided to downsize, she reached out to me. She refused to list the property on the open market. She sold it to me directly, at a steep discount, with a handshake, and a quiet understanding that the land would remain in the hands of someone who understood duty, sacrifice, and honor. It wasn't a standard real estate transaction. It was a transfer of legacy. Curtis thought he had found a vulnerability by questioning the purchase price. He thought he could argue the transaction was irregular and therefore subject to marital review. He didn't realize he was unearthing a titanium foundation. He was trying to apply standard family court logic to a bond forged in grief and military brotherhood. My lawyer forwarded me Curtis's frantic filings. I reviewed them with analytical detachment. Marcus and his attorney were building a house of cards on a fault line. They were about to step into a courtroom, armed with entitlement and arrogance, completely blind to the historical weight of the land they were trying to steal. The county courtroom smelled of lemon polish and old paper. I sat at the petitioner's table, my posture rigid, my composure absolute. I wore my Class A service uniform, the dark green fabric perfectly pressed, my promotion ribbons pinned with mathematical precision. I didn't wear it for sympathy. I wore it as a statement of fact. This was my identity, the very thing Marcus had used as an insult. Before us sat Judge Rebecca Hill, a stern woman known for her clinical efficiency. Marcus sat across the aisle, sweating through his expensive suit. Beside him, Curtis shuffled through stacks of documents, radiating aggressive, nervous energy. When Judge Hill called the session to order, Curtis immediately launched into his offensive. He paced the floor, spinning a narrative of marital equity. He argued that despite the deed being in my name, the property had served as the marital domicile for 2 decades. He claimed Marcus had provided essential domestic stability while I was deployed, an emotional investment that entitled him to half the property's value. It was a beautiful fiction, an elegant lie wrapped in legal terminology. My attorney didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or object. He simply stood up and called our sole witness to the stand. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and 80-year-old Eleanor Vance walked down the center aisle. She moved slowly, but with undeniable dignity, leaning slightly on a polished cane. She was a retired civil judge herself, a woman who commanded respect by merely occupying a room. Marcus frowned, confused. Curtis flipped frantically through his witness list, his face paling as he recognized her name. Eleanor took the stand, swore the oath, and looked directly at Judge Hill. My attorney asked her to explain the circumstances surrounding the sale of 428 Ridge Road. Eleanor's voice was clear, cutting through the quiet courtroom like a precision laser. "I sold that homestead to Victoria Hayes 22 years ago," Eleanor stated, her gaze shifting to Marcus with quiet disdain. "I intentionally sold it below market value. It was not a commercial investment. It was a transfer of stewardship. Victoria brought my grandson's effects home to me. I sold her the land because of our shared respect for service, duty, and honor. The property was transferred to her, and her alone, as an individual who understood the weight of that legacy." Eleanor paused, tapping her cane lightly on the floor. It was never intended to benefit a man who would refer to her service as an insult. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Curtis slowly sank into his chair, realizing his entire legal strategy had just been vaporized. He had tried to argue marital equity against a retired civil judge, testifying to a specific, exclusionary transfer of legacy. Judge Hill didn't hesitate. She didn't retreat to her chambers to deliberate. She looked at the documents, looked at Eleanor, and then looked at Marcus. "The deed is clear. The intent of the original transfer is irrefutable," Judge Hill declared, her gavel coming down with a sharp, decisive crack. "This property is a premarital asset. The respondent has no legal claim. The eviction stands." I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply nodded. The ledger was balanced. The court order triggered a mandatory 30-day vacating window. I remained in the extended stay suite with Maya, maintaining absolute operational distance, while the blast radius of the court's decision expanded. Marcus and Celeste were forced to return to the house they had tried to steal, strictly to pack their belongings. The reality of their situation descended rapidly, crushing their toxic romance under the unbearable weight of financial disappointment. Celeste had signed up for a comfortable life in a fully paid-off historic homestead. She had envisioned herself the new mistress of 428 Ridge Road, elevated by Marcus's supposed wealth. Instead, she found herself boxing up her clothes in a house she was legally barred from inhabiting, tied to a man who had just been publicly stripped of his primary asset. Their relationship, built entirely on entitlement and deception, imploded within days. According to the security feeds I monitored for property protection, the arguments started on day 3. By day 6, The shouting matches echoed in the empty hallways. Celeste wasn't interested in rebuilding from the ground up. She recognized a bad investment when she saw one. Within a week, she vanished. A moving van pulled up while Marcus was out, and Celeste took everything she owned, blocking his number and disappearing into the city. She had been a subscription to a luxury lifestyle, and the moment Marcus's credit card declined, she canceled the service. Marcus's collapse accelerated. The public exposure of the courtroom battle bled into his professional life. He was a mid-level manager at a logistics firm that valued stability and reputation. The details of his attempted asset theft and the harsh rebuke from a retired civil judge circulated through his industry like a virus. It wasn't a sudden firing. It was a methodical, clinical removal. He was quietly eased out of client-facing roles. His major accounts were reassigned. By week 3 of the vacating window, he was offered a meager severance package and told his services were no longer required. He had tried to bankrupt me emotionally and financially, but karmic justice is an impeccable auditor. He ended up with nothing. No house, no mistress, no job. The final indignity came on day 29. The security cameras showed Marcus carrying his last few cardboard boxes out to a rented sedan. He looked defeated, his shoulders slumped, the arrogant posture from a month ago completely erased. He locked the front door and slid the keys into the designated drop box. I watched the screen from my laptop, feeling no pity, no remorse, and no anger. He had made a calculated decision to betray his family for a perceived upgrade. He had simply run the numbers wrong. The transaction was complete. The eviction finalized. The property was secure. On day 31, Maya and I returned permanently to 428 Ridge Road. The house felt different the moment we crossed the threshold. It no longer carried the heavy, stagnant air of Marcus's deceit. It was clean, quiet, and entirely ours. We didn't waste time looking backward. The operation was about securing the future. Our first objective was reclaiming the space. We spent the weekend painting Maya's bedroom, a pale, vibrant green, erasing the dull beige Marcus had insisted on years ago. She laughed as we rolled the paint onto the walls, her small hands covered in green specks. That laughter was the final confirmation that my tactical decisions had been correct. We weren't alone in the rebuilding phase. The community around us, neighbors who had witnessed the quiet dignity of my long game, stepped forward with practical support. Fellow comrades from my unit arrived unannounced with tools, helping to repair the fence Marcus had neglected and clear the overgrown garden. There was no pity in their actions, only the silent, unyielding support of people who recognized a fellow soldier holding her ground. We shared coffee on the porch, discussing hardware and landscaping, avoiding any mention of the man who used to occupy the space. He was a closed file. Before the weekend was over, I took a hammer and a nail and found the perfect spot by the front door. I hung my official promotion photo, the one taken the day I achieved Master Sergeant. In the picture, my uniform is flawless, my expression resolute. I placed it there not out of vanity, but as a quiet reminder of what I had survived and what I was capable of defending. It stands as a daily declaration of sovereignty over my own life. Every time I walk through that door, I remember the discipline it took to smile when everything was supposed to fall apart. I've come to realize that forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it certainly doesn't mean allowing toxic people back into your perimeter. True security isn't something someone else can give you, and it isn't something tied to a marriage certificate. True security is self-forged. It is the invisible armor you build through patience, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to your own worth. We are safe, we are happy, and we are standing on solid ground. If this story resonated with your own journey of standing tall, when others underestimated you, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe so we can keep walking through these journeys together.